Hi everybody. Throughout this module we talk about effective instruction, and your book does a really good job of giving you guys a good general overview of effective instruction. But I wanted to provide you guys with a little more information about what we found in the research. And there's a really large body of research, often referred to as teacher effectiveness or teacher effects research. And basically, there's over 100 correlational and experimental studies that focus on the teacher's role in presenting information to the students and also engaging them in active learning activities and assignments. And so within this research, we've identified kind of 8 main principles that are consistent across all of this research. So I made this chart for you guys just to kind of summarize some main points of all of the 8 principles. And as we go through the semester and as we go through the course, we're going to be talking about these principles in more depth. So here's kind of the general document, and I'm going to go ahead and zoom in so we can talk about principle 1. So the first principle is to maximize academic engaged time. So basically, the greater amount of time that a student devotes to a particular subject or skill, the more likely that student is to master that subject or skill. And so in classrooms, the most effective teachers, students typically spend most of their available time doing some type of instructional activity rather than non-academic activities or games. And the amount of time that students spend on those instructional activities is what we refer to as time on task. So you want to always increase the time on task, or to increase the amount of time your students spend engaging in those instructional activities. Now, I want to make a point that there is a difference between the amount of time you set aside for activity, which we refer to as the allocated time, versus the actual time in which the student is actively involved in the instructional activity, which is called our academic engaged time. And so a lot of times teachers will allocate maybe 45 minutes to a lesson, but that doesn't mean, and hardly ever means, that the students are actually engaging in those instructional tasks the whole 45 minutes. So there are a lot of time wasters that teachers can get presented with. One example of a time waster is what we call a digression. And basically this is when the teacher talks about an irrelevant subject, sorry guys, I'm stumbling on my words, during the lecture. So if you guys have ever had teachers that kind of get off and tell stories that don't correspond to the content area, that's what we mean by digression. There can be disruptions. So, specifically classroom management, stopping instruction to manage student behavior, and things like that. There can be some downtime, so you might have kids that finish the activity quicker than others and don't have anything to do and are just sitting there. There can be interruptions. You can get phone calls. People can come into your classroom. There can be a lack of organization. So teachers can misplace worksheets, not begin class immediately when the bell rings, which oftentimes happens because it's kind of crazy when the bell rings. There can be unclear directions. So the teacher can give an assignment but not really fully explain what the students are supposed to do, which results in kind of lots of questions and chaos in the classroom that results in time wasting. There can be inappropriate assignments. So the teacher can give students assignments that are not the correct level of difficulty. So either giving students assignments that are too easy or too hard. And then the transitions might possibly take too long. So, students might wait as the teacher attempts to locate materials for the next lesson and things like that. And that corresponds to our lack of organization as well. So how do you actually increase academic engaged time? And one way that you can do this is to pre-teach the content. So this is when you actually provide brief exposure to new material prior to the primary instruction. So if you know that there's some vocabulary words that you haven't taught within the instruction, then you might pre-teach those before you actually teach your content or your instructional content. You want to plan lessons that maximize engagement. So if you plan a 60-minute reading period, you want to make sure you incorporate activities that require students to be engaged and respond to instruction for at least 80% of that 60-minute period, so about 48 minutes. Sometimes going to be taken up with transitions and things like that, but you want to make sure that you plan activities for at least 80% of your allocated time. You want to make sure that you use time efficiently. So you want to make sure that, you've established those classroom routines. You provided a brisk pace for the learning activities. You provided clear directions. You're explicit, you're direct. You're questioning students frequently. You're managing transition times. And then you're also praising and reinforcing students as well. So that's really important. And once again, that kind of touches on these last 2 points. So making sure that you improve your class management skills. So what we find is the quality and quantity of student engagement actually depends on your ability to organize and manage the classroom as an effective learning environment. So that way all of your academic activities run really smoothly and there are no disruptions and time wasters. And then the last one, like I just mentioned, making sure that you guys reinforce students for being engaged. If a student is on task, then make sure that you verbally praise that student. If a student is not on task, you can praise somebody that is, and a lot of times you get that observational learning if praise is a reinforcer for those students. If not, you can use something else, token boards or other things like that, which we'll talk about within the course. All right, our second principle is to ensure high rates of correct responding. So what the research shows is that an important variable in a student's learning is actually the number of response opportunities that he or she has during your instructional activity. So we call this opportunities to respond. And students should actually have the chance to respond about 4 to 6 times per minute during instruction, and then 8 or 9 times per minute during independent practice. And not only is it important that they have opportunities to respond, but it's also really important that students experience a high rate of success in the academic tasks that they're assigned. So they really need to respond correctly about 80% of the time. And the research shows that there's a strong positive relationship between high rates of success and academic achievement. So the more your students can respond correctly to your opportunities to respond, the more successful they'll be in their academic skills. What's interesting is that children with aggression make way less correct responses than kids without aggression. So they make about 0.014 to 0.21 correct responses per minute, which equates to about 5 to 8 correct responses per day, which is really, really low. And what they've also shown is oftentimes those correct responses, they don't always get praised afterwards. So the probability that they'll get praised is not 100%. So sometimes the teacher will praise them and sometimes they won't. So they end up only getting praise statements about 3.5 times per day, which is also really low. And the research also shows that asking kids with emotional behavior disorders to respond without giving them proper instruction increases their challenging behaviors. So, this shows us that teachers who are teaching kids with aggression and emotional behavior disorders, the fact that they're not making as many correct responses per day as they should be, actually shows us that these teachers are not really engaging in effective teaching. So when teachers do engage in effective teaching, so when they engage in behaviors such as modeling, giving positive statements and attention, and providing that corrective feedback, the students actually produce more correct academic responses. But we typically don't see that with, our children with emotional and behavior disorders. So really making sure that you are providing that effective effective instruction so that your students, especially your students with emotional behavior disorders, can be more successful. And then making sure that you reinforce those correct responses can be a game changer. It can be really, really important. And then going back to this last point, if you don't give them that proper instruction, the tasks that you're asking them to do are more difficult than they know how to do. And when you present them with tasks that are more difficult, you're more likely to get challenging behavior. And the research shows that that challenging behavior allows them to escape having to answer those questions. All right, the third principle is to maximize the amount of content covered. And so when we talk about the amount of content covered, we're talking about the amount of academic content to which students are exposed to throughout the school year. And what we typically show is that if you increase the amount of content presented to the students, then you will increase their academic skills. So an increase in opportunities to learn content are correlated positively with increased student achievement. And some people claim that this is the single most important instructional principle, and it has to do with determining your long-term goals. So when you determine your long-term goals, you want to make sure that you plan to cover as much content as possible. Now with federal regulations, all states have some type of achievement test with standards that we typically give kids every year. And so those state standards will typically have some type of curriculum, and therefore you guys can look to that curriculum and refer to the scope and sequence to plan out your long-term goals. So when we talk about scope, we're talking about the amount of content that will be covered, and the sequence refers to the order in which the content will be covered. So you can use the state standards to set your goals for the amount of content you need to cover and how that needs to be sequenced. If you don't have those state standards and you don't have that curriculum, then typically you can use teachers' manuals or things like that, or maybe your team has some ideas and you guys can plan that together. The fourth principle is to match assignments to student ability. And I've kind of touched on this previously, but if tasks are too difficult, then students misbehave because that challenging behavior usually lets them escape the task. So it's really important to plan the activities that match the student's academic level, and then make sure that, it's also really important, make sure that you're monitoring correct responses and error rates. And knowing where kids are on the difficulty level is really important. So you may have to take a complex task that the child can't do and do a task analysis and break it down into little parts. And we're going to talk about task analysis within the course, so I'm going to just say that for now. But you can assess abilities by those standardized achievement tests, norm reference tests, curriculum-based assessments, things like that. And then we're going to also talk about in the course some ways to monitor student progress. All right, our fifth principle is to teach academic content explicitly. So with this, we're referring to a systematic method of teaching with emphasis on small steps, checking for student understanding, and achieving active and successful participation from all students. So I want to stress all students. Effective teachers typically actively instruct their students by demonstrating skills, explaining concepts, giving the students lots of opportunities to practice, opportunities to respond, and reviewing frequently and providing feedback. Explicit teaching, basically, you want to make sure that you're active. So the most effective teachers are teachers that actively plan to systematically teach the content explicitly. So this is something that you have to plan for, and you have to be active in that planning. All right, and we typically have what we call 6 teaching functions, and I'm just going to give a brief overview because like I mentioned before, we're going to talk about these within the course. But the first thing is that you want to make sure you do a daily review. So make sure that you check in and that they learn the material from the previous lesson, so review homework or whatever it is. Then you want to do the presentation. So you want to teach the new materials or skills. You want to ask questions, state the goal of the lesson, present the new material in small steps. You want to model if you need to, provide examples, check for student understanding, and then also provide that feedback. And with our kids with EBD, it's okay to overteach. They actually need that. They need that additional instruction. Then you want to do guided practice. So closely monitor practice activities for students. Provide practice activities with additional help, ask questions, provide feedback, do some choral responding maybe if you're doing DI. Continue practicing until students are fluent. And then, yeah, just make sure your students are practicing and you're providing feedback. And of course, the next one is that corrective feedback. So making sure you're responding to students' answers. If the student is correct, then praise it. If the student is incorrect, you can still praise for the effort and then give process feedback and reteach if you need to. Independent practice is also really important. So making sure that students have the ability to practice independently. This helps them move towards fluency. So you can give students independent work, you can do computer work, peer-assisted learning, homework, things like that. And then the last thing is weekly and monthly reviews. So just making sure that the students are learning and practicing those skills that have been taught. So you might review the previous week's work each Monday, or review previous month's work every fourth Monday, something like that. All right, the next principle is scaffold student instruction. So this refers to an instructional strategy in which teachers provide students with support while they're learning the skills and then systematically withdraw that support. So we find that students are more likely to become independent, self-regulated learners when teachers deliberately and carefully scaffold their instruction. And they found that a key finding of the teacher effectiveness literature is that teachers who elicit strong achievement test scores actively scaffold their students' learning rather than expecting the student to kind of learn the material on their own. So scaffolding student instruction is really important to set your students up for success. And there's a couple ways you can do this. You can use prompts, you can use a think aloud procedure, you can ask a lot of questions, you can very closely monitor the guided practice, and then you can also provide those study guides, outlines, task organizers, things like that. And we'll talk about a lot of these procedures in the course. The next principle is to use direct instruction. So this typically focuses on delivering instruction, not instructional design. So a lot of the other principles have focused on more of the instructional design. This one is focusing on actually delivering instruction. Direct instruction is research-based, so it's a research-based curriculum, and it's very popular because it's effective with a wide variety of students. So typically developing students, students with disabilities, students with EBD, things like that. And it's used to teach those basic skills. And basically it is a model of teacher-directed explicit instruction. And there's 4 components to it. There's instructional grouping, so you're going to group children, put children in groups. There's academic engaged time, so making sure that when you're presenting DI, there's a large percentage of the time being involved with that academic engaged time. There's a scripted presentation, so the teacher has a script that the teacher follows, and it involves kind of these things down here. So rapid pacing, individual responding, signaling, some choral responding with the group, corrective feedback, reteaching, reinforcement, guided practice, independent practice. I've had experience with doing a little bit of direct instruction. When one of the clinics that I worked at, we used a program called Language for Learning, and I can tell you it was very scripted, it was very fast-paced, and if you were going to do it with the kids, you had to practice. It was something that, yeah, like I said, you needed a lot of practice on. It was fun, it was fast-moving. Like I said, you got that choral responding, the signaling, very effective, but it does take some training and practicing on your part. And then you have this continuous assessment part as well. So you're always assessing the students, figuring out how many correct responses they had, how many responses you had to prompt, and that way you can continually assess their progress. And the last principle is to monitor your student progress. So this is really important. Your success as a teacher depends on your students' progress. So making sure that you're always providing that ongoing evaluation. And there's a difference between formative evaluations and summative evaluations. So formative evaluations are those ongoing evaluations, whereas summative are evaluations that happen maybe at the end of the school year or something like that. And we're going to talk about monitoring student progress. You guys should have a way to, you guys should be measuring behaviors that that are objective, that you can actually see, that you can actually measure, and therefore you should be able to graph your data and see the progress in your students' learning with regards to the graph, and making sure that what you're doing is effective by the way that your data paths are going. Making sure that if you want the behavior to increase, that the behavior is actually increasing, and you can actually see that on the graph. So those are your 8 principles. If you guys have any questions as you're going through this or anything like that, then please let me know. All right, thanks guys.